Uncertainty. It's like floating in an open space with no hopes of ever coming down. Uncertainty is painful and disturbing and keeps one up at night. The Foster was no different. They tossed in their various beds all night. They all looked at the door with expectations any time they heard the doorbell ring, pushed their food around on their plates, and always smiled too brightly to assure themselves that everything was okay. But everything was not okay. Atlas Foster had been gone for a long time, longer than how they had estimated he would stay when his unit was last deployed for service. The force could not offer any tangible information to his family. Days went by, weeks followed suit, and so did a year, and Atlas was yet to come home. His fiance's sister, Chrissy, advised her, Candace, to try to move on from him. Candace flared up at her sister. How could she advise her to move on from her Atlas? He was not even dead. He was just away from home for a while. She did not want to move on. Even if she wanted to, she did not even know where to begin from. After her sister bit her head off because of the unsolicited advice she had offered, Chrissy backed off and let Candace deal with the situation the way she deemed appropriate. And Candace did. Candace always liked to look at the positive side of life, and it had always worked out for her. In middle school, when she still danced ballet, the school provided tutus for all the girls. But when it reached her turn, the last tutu was torn, and she had to use the one she used for her practice. And it looked way older than the one the other students wore. But she wore it happily. Later that day, on stage, all the girls who wore the tutus the school had provided began to itch their thighs, and they ran off the stage in tears. Only Candace was saved from the itch pandemic, as she was the only person who remained on the stage. In college, when she hung out with her friends at a new restaurant, they ordered their meal, and when the waiter brought it, he said a plate was not ready yet, and Candace had to wait. She waited without complaining, and her friends dug into theirs. Barely 3 minutes later, her friends who had a garlic allergy, just like her, began to get hives, and Candace was saved from that. She was so lucky she might as well have been a unicorn in her past life. She always looked at the positive aspects of things. When people saw a half-empty glass, Candace saw a half-full one. From middle school to high school and then to college, she remained positive. It had not failed her before, so why stop now? After college, she became a guidance counselor at a high school, and that was where she met Atlas. And no, he was not a teacher there or a student. He was the principal's husband. Atlas was not much of a looker. His eyes were far apart from each other, and his nose always seemed to flare up. They bumped into themselves in the hallway, and stared at each other longer than the conventionally accepted time for strangers to stare at themselves. When he put out his hand to steady her, she felt the coldness of his wedding band touch her arm. So why then did she still want him? He smiled at her and moved off in his direction to the principal's office, and she moved on back to her office. Later that day, she showed up at her office and said that he only wanted to say hi before he went on his way. Candace was not dumb. She knew that she was pretty, and with the people-reading skills that she had, she knew that the man felt her the way she did him. The only thing that stopped them to try and act on the attraction was the gold band around his finger, a not-so-subtle reminder of the vows he said to his wife. She offered him a seat, and he took it. Out of curiosity, she asked him what brought him to the school, and he said that he went over to give his wife her inhaler that she forgot at home. She asked who his wife was, and when she found out that it was the principal, she decided to stay away. A decision that lasted all of 5 minutes, and it was not as though Candace actively wanted to be with someone else's husband. In fact, she used to despise people who caught feelings for someone else's partner. Until it happened to her. She fell so fast for Atlas, it was unreal. And as usual, she was lucky, because as hard and as fast as she fell for him, so did he also fall for her. Atlas had exchanged contacts with her after he wanted to leave her office that day. He said that sometimes he needed guidance on certain things, and that it wouldn't hurt to have her advise him, right? It was a stupid thing to say. If he wanted guidance, there were 100 other guidance counselors that he could go to for help. There were professional therapists scattered all around town. And even if he wanted her as his counselor, that was definitely not the way to go about it. But they both knew that Atlas did not give a shit about any guidance. She knew that when she input her number in his phone, he knew that when he texted her in the next weekend to ask her how she was, and she knew that when she replied to the text. Candace always considered herself a rational person. When her sister wanted to abandon her final exams and fly from Minnesota to Texas to see if her girlfriend really was cheating on her, she stopped her. When her friend Joanne wanted to buy a beautiful dress that was 2 sizes smaller than her just so that she could look at it in the wardrobe and admire it, she advised her against it. Why then did she not have the common sense to stay away from not just anyone but her boss's husband? Maybe things were desirable when they were supposed to be off limits. They hung out together, they had dinner, they texted all the time, and in 6 months, Atlas and Candace were in love. Atlas was not happy in his marriage with the principal. They got married early, and they had been married for 4 years, and the romance had fizzled out. They lived like strangers who showed kind gestures to each other, but when he met Candace, she awakened something inside of him, and he liked it. Candace liked it as well, but she did not like how she felt any time she got back home from spending time with Atlas. She felt stupid and filthy. Whenever she ran into the principal, she felt guilty. She did not like it, so she gave Atlas an ultimatum. She asked him to choose between his married life or life with her. It was not difficult for him to make the decision, and he chose her. His wife, too, was not hurt. If anything, she seemed relieved that the marriage was being annulled. Atlas's ex-wife also did not feel any form of resentment towards Candace when she found out that her husband had been seeing and left her for Candace. The woman tried to make conversation with Candace, but maybe Candace still felt a little guilty or the whole situation was too weird for her. Either way, she was elated when the principal took a different job offer some months later and left the school. With his marriage out of the way, their relationship became easier. Atlas had moved out of the house that he shared with his wife, so she urged him to move into hers. They lived together and loved together. Whenever she got home from work, he was there. They did not have to hide their relationship anymore, and they went out to clubs and danced whenever they felt like it. They ate straight from takeout packets and laughed in their living room. They went to baking classes together and attended as many sip and paints as Candace wanted to go to. They did not even fight. Atlas was a laid-back person and was always okay to go with whatever Candace wanted. Candace, who always wanted a lot, always made sure to check if Atlas wanted to go with any idea for fun, or just because he thought that she would like it. Once, he reluctantly agreed to go with her to the farmer's market, and from there to a boutique to shop for a pair of shoes. Candace noticed his hesitance, and she called him out for it. She told him that he did not have to go along with everything she said, and that he could have a say too. He said he knew, but he only always wanted to make her happy. Candace was elated at the answer, but she still told him that his happiness meant just as much as hers, and that if he did not want to go along with an idea of hers, all he had to do was to say something. He said he would try, and she said okay. But he still went with her to the farmer's market and the boutique. A few months after they started living together, Atlas got a message from the U.S. Marines. Since he was little, Atlas knew that he always wanted to be in the Marines because of his dad and grandfather both served in the military. He liked the idea of being in a uniform, the honor and respect that came along with serving the country in that form, and the fulfillment that he would feel if he went along with his life dream. But he danced around the idea for a long time. He knew that serving in the military was no child's play, and that if he wanted to serve, he had to be sure to his bones. And he was not so sure. Of course, he wanted to serve just like the paternal figures in his life. He knew that much. But was he ready for the sacrosanct duty that came along? The long hours, the distance, being deployed. Sure, they all sounded great in theory, but what about when they were being broken down? Would serving in the U.S. Marines still sound enticing when he got drenched in the rain, or when he got spent from exercises, or when he missed his bed? These thoughts bothered him, and for a long time, he ignored his dream of serving in the military. Until when he met Candace. It seemed stupid that he would love someone and still go on to sign up for the Marines. It would have sounded stupid to anyone if he told them, but Atlas knew what he was doing. Candace had shown him that if he wanted something, he had to go out and get it. Sure, he was married when he met her, and she knew that he was married, but she still went for what she wanted. And when it felt like it was getting difficult to have him to herself, she gave him an ultimatum. She came out outrightly and asked him to choose between having her or losing her. Really, there was no need to float in the uncertainty. There was no need to hang around and dodge from what he wanted. So Atlas went after what he wanted. The Marine and Candace. Every choice came with its downsides, as well as its upside. Candace was ready to love him fully, even though she worked in the same establishment as his ex-wife. If his ex-wife had taken the divorce badly and they found out that Candace was the cause of it, she would have been in a situation of animosity. Maybe some staff in the school would have hated her, and she would have been the topic of gossip for a long, long time. Candace knew all of these, but she also knew that loving Atlas was worth it, and she made the decision. So, Atlas related it to his military ambition. Sure, sometimes he might hate it. Maybe sometimes he would regret ever joining the force, but it would be worth it. Also, was there any job that did not have its downsides? So, Atlas quit his job as a hotel manager and signed up for the Marines. He did not fully disclose why he quit his job to Candace. When she asked, he told her that he wanted to change some stuff in his life, and the job was one of them. So, when the message from the U.S. Marines arrived, it was safe to say that Candace was livid, and they had their first fight. She accused him of withholding such a piece of crucial information from her, and he said he did not withhold anything. He said he was not sure that he would be considered to join the force, and because of that, he did not think it would be necessary to bring up the topic for discussion. The excuse only annoyed her more, and she yelled at him. Did he not know what it meant to be in a relationship? Whether it worked out or not, he was supposed to tell her stuff like this. And the bomber, now that it had worked out, what was his plan? Atlas said that he was not sure yet, and would think about it. Candace walked out and left him in the living room. He would think about it. Okay. He left her in the dark and pursued his dream of being in the military, and now he would think about it. If he had signed up before he met her, she would have been less angry, but no, he signed up months after he met her, quit his job, gave her a vague explanation, kept everything from her, and now that his dreams were coming through, what was she supposed to do? Weren't they a team? Was he not supposed to discuss important things like this with her? Atlas knew that she was mad, and he also knew that she had every reason to be like that. When he first kept the information from her, he thought he was doing their relationship good. The relationship was new, and it did not need the stress of such weighty conversations on it. But now that the U.S. Marines had contacted him, he realized that he should have told her. He should have involved her every step of the way, because she would be affected as much as he would be when he got recruited. So he walked into their bedroom, where she was angrily dusting the bed with a white sheet. He hugged her from behind, and she struggled to free herself from his arms. When he noticed that she was hell-bent on not answering him at the moment, he let her be and walked back into the living room. He sat there until later that night and went back into the room to sleep. When he walked in, Candace, who he expected to be asleep, was still awake and on her phone. He moved closer to her and sat next to her on the bed. She ignored him. Knowing that he had his work cut out for him, he said, "Candace, babe, I'm sorry." She ignored him again and continued to type on her phone. With her acrylic nails, the phone made a tap-tap sound every time she tapped on it, and he liked it. He held her hand gently and said, "Hey, babe, I'm trying to apologize here. Can you give me an ear, please?" She did not look up at him when she said, "Go on." Atlas told her, "I know that I'm wrong for withholding such information from you, and I'm sorry. I just did not know how to bring it up." She rolled her eyes at him and said, "You did not have to bring it up because I already did when I asked you why you quit your job. All you had to do was tell me the truth. Why did you lie?" Atlas said, "I'm sorry." She snatched her hand from his and answered, "I know you are, but why did you lie to me?" Then he told her the truth. He said that he did not want to put a strain on their relationship. He said that he was scared of how she would take it. He said that he knew when he said it out loud to her, it would make it more real, and he was not ready to miss her when he went off. He said that he would miss her. He said that he was sorry. Candace understood him. She too did not know how she would have reacted if she was told about the military ambition earlier on in the relationship. Maybe she would have struggled to make him drop it. Maybe she would have asked him for something trivial she did not know. Maybe, but what she did know was that she would miss him when he went off. She would miss their cute little dates. She would miss the nights they ate takeout directly from the boxes and laughed when sauce dribbled down his chin. Atlas went on, "I don't know what this means for us. I obviously still want you, now more than ever if I'm being honest. What do you want, Candace?" Was he insane? Of course she still wanted to be with him. Yeah, she would miss him when he was miles away from her, but it would all be worth it when he came back. She could not imagine being with anyone else, especially just because he was off serving his country. Atlas did not know it, but his military ambition made him more desirable to her. It made her want him more. She rolled her eyes at him and said, "Of course I still want to be with you. Do you think joining the military would get you away from me? You better try harder." Her answer made Atlas's entire body relax. A part of him thought that she would want to leave him, and it was understandable. He did not think anyone would want their loved one, their romantic partner, miles away from them, not to talk of in the military. He would have understood if she did not want to continue dating him. It would have sliced his heart into bits and pieces, but he would have understood. However, she had to go ahead and give him the best news he had ever received. She said she would still be with him. Atlas was so happy he pulled her to him and dropped kisses on her hair while she giggled and playfully struggled in his arms. He finally let her go, but only to look at her face. She was smiling at him, but he could see that the smile did not quite reach his eyes. He could see that she still had reservations about his joining the military, so he told her, "Candace, if you are not okay with my decision, you can tell me, right?" She nodded at him. He slid up closer to her and said, "Then talk to me." She averted her eyes from his and tried to adjust herself on the bed. Then he said, Hey, look at me." When she did not, he used his palms to lift her face to his, but she still averted her eyes to the door at his back. His voice was strangled when he pleaded, "Babe, please look at me." It was like an eternity before she did, and when she did, she blinked rapidly to quell the tears in her eyes. He pulled her into his arms and said, "Talk to me, please. Don't you still want to be with me?" Candace was silent for some time. She did not want to cry. It felt silly. He was only going off to the military. It's not like he was diagnosed with a deathly disease or anything, and he was not going to leave immediately. They still had some time to spend together, so why was she crying? She answered him, "Atlas, I said I want to be with you and I mean that. That is not even up for discussion." He smiled inwardly at her bossy tone as she went on. "I don't know why I'm crying. It seems silly to cry, right? I don't know why the tears just won't stop." But Atlas knew why she was crying. It was the same reason that would keep him up at night when he would be away, and the reasons why he would keep struggling to come back to her. They were in love, and they would miss each other when he went off. It was that simple. Silently, he pulled her to him and said, "I'm sorry." It was a simple statement, but it held so much weight. He was sorry for all the nights she would miss him. He was sorry for the days she would want to look at him, and all she would be able to do would be to look at pictures on her phone. He was sorry for the days she would eat takeout alone in the living room. He was sorry for the nights she would sleep alone in their bed. He was sorry for all the sip and paint classes that she would attend alone. He was sorry for the days she would come back to meet an empty apartment. But what he was mostly sorry for was the fact that he did not want to let go of his dream. He still wanted to pursue the ambition of being a U.S. Marine, and the irony was that she was the one who gave him the courage to face that pursuit. She stayed in his arms for a while before she turned and faced him again. She smiled at him. This time, the smile was better than the previous one, and it warmed his heart. She told him, "It's okay, babe." He placed a single kiss on her temple, and she adjusted herself on the bed. He lay down next to her, and they began to talk about stuff as though they weren't just emotional and in each other's arms a few moments ago. It was the beauty of being in a relationship with someone who loved and understood you on the same level as you did them. One minute, you could be talking about your military ambition and how it would affect your relationship. The other minute, you would be laughing as your partner told you about how her sister's ex-girlfriend stole all her coupons before she left the relationship. Candace talked about how her sister, Chrissy, planned to chase down her ex-girlfriend to her family's house in Ohio on Thanksgiving and demand all of her coupons. And Atlas laughed and joked and said he was in full support of Chrissy and her insane vengeance plan. Topics drifted from sisters and their crazy plans to the burger place down the street and their nice burgers, to the kid in school who gave her a hard time, and how she wanted the boy to be okay. They talked and talked. They talked and talked, and that night, they fell asleep in each other's arms. When it was time for Atlas to leave for boot camp, they were in tears again. Candace cried as she kissed him goodbye, and he promised to call as soon as he could. That night, she slept in his pajamas. He called her the next day, and he said that he had settled in and that he was allowed one phone call. He asked how she was doing, and she lied, and said that she was fine, even though all she really wanted was to be in his arms and kiss him goodnight. Atlas could detect the sadness in her voice, and he told her to hold on. He said he would be back soon. He told her to have fun and hang out with her friends, and she said she would try. He said that the recruitment training took only 13 weeks, and in no time, he would be back with her. She nodded at him before she remembered that he could not see her. Then she spoke out loud. The phone was retrieved from Atlas when his time to talk was over, and she stood there in her living room and clutched her phone to her aching chest. She did not want to ache. It was only a few weeks before she could see him again. It felt silly that he was beat up about it. During the 13 weeks that Atlas stayed in boot camp, he sent a lot of letters to Candace, and he received a lot from her as well. They tried to keep themselves in on their different lifestyles. She told him about the day she had to offer the last carrot in the farmer's market to an elderly woman who begged for it, and he told her about the exercises he had to do. She said that Chrissy finally forgave her ex-girlfriend, and he said that he wished he was there with her. She said she missed him, and he did too. He said he loved her, and she did too. Hours, days, and months passed, and before she knew it, 13 weeks were over. When Atlas walked into the apartment that afternoon, her scream of joy could be heard from down the street as she jumped on him and hugged him as tight as she could. He hugged her as well. She kissed all around his shaved face to the small scar on his lower jaw. She took a bath with him and they talked as they sat in the lavender-scented bathtub. He said that the training was more difficult than he expected, and that he had body aches for a whole week after the first exercise. She laughed as she moved to him. He welcomed her with open arms, and she placed a kiss on his shoulder, and she promised to massage him. They both slept soundly that night. The next day, he said that he did not have a lot of time to stay with her because they were only asked to stay for a few days before they turned. She already expected that he would not stay for a long period, and she was not fazed by his news. She simply smiled at him and said, "Then let us make the most of the time." Her sister Chrissy came over to see Atlas when she informed him that he was back, and she proceeded to talk all about her new girlfriend. When Candace asked her to let Atlas talk, she ignored him and said how much she had grown and how much of a bigger person she was for no longer bothering her ex-girlfriend for the coupons. When she left, Candace was visibly relaxed. She loved her sister, but sometimes the girl could be such a pain in the ass. Atlas said that he did not mind it, and he was happy to be let in on her relationship drama again. They ordered rice and chicken from the Chinese restaurant that they loved and ate in the living room. Then, as promised, she gave him a massage. He laid face flat on the bed as she sat on his back as she massaged him. Her small hands felt soft as they glided down his back, and they hardly carried the strength of a masseuse, but they felt good and relaxing. She talked to him as her hands rubbed softly on his neck, and he could hear her speaking, but his brain could barely register what she was saying. She talked, and when she said something funny, she would laugh a little. It felt nice, lying face flat in a room, having the woman he loved sitting on his back while she massaged him and talked to him about what he could not even comprehend. Candace was it. She was all he had wanted. He did not like to compare her with his ex-wife because they were two different people, and he had fallen in love with them at entirely different stages of life, but sometimes he had to compare them. Yes, he had loved his ex-wife, but it was nothing as close to what he felt for the woman who sat on his back and tried to massage him with her little hands. Candace awoken something inside of him. She made a fire flame up back in his chest. She made him laugh. She made him cry. She made him miss her. She made him love. And without even knowing it, she made him pursue his dream. He did not even know when he blurted out, "I need to marry you, Candace." Her hands stilled on his back as she asked him, "What? What did you just say?" Atlas had already let the cat out of the bag. There was no need to struggle and put it back inside the bag, so he said, "I really need to marry you." Candace's body remained still, and he wanted to see her face, so he turned to face her. She lifted her body and sat down next to him on the bed. When he faced her, he repeated himself, "I need to marry you, Candace. I want to marry you." She blinked at him as he asked, "Are you proposing?" He looked at her as though she suddenly sprouted a second head and said, "Is that not obvious already?" She shook her head at him. "It's not." He knew Candace was particular about certain things, so he lifted himself from his lying position into a kneeling one, still on the bed, and asked, "Candace, babe, will you marry me?" Slowly, beautifully, a soft smile appeared on her face as she nodded at him. "Of course, Atlas. Of course I will marry you." Then she flung herself at him, and with a laugh, he caught her. If she was being truthful, she had begun to expect an engagement ring from him before he even went off to boot camp, and she was elated that it had finally happened. She laid on him and asked, "Where is my ring?" Atlas teased her. "Do you really need one?" She played along. "Well, not necessarily, but don't blame me if men think I'm single and advance towards me." Atlas laughed. That does make a valid point. When she looked down at him expectantly, he explained, "I don't have a ring. Not for now, at least. I did not plan to propose to you today," and Candace cut him off as she placed her index finger on his lips. He softly bit it, and she giggled before she said, "It's okay, babe. You can get the ring when you are ready." He nodded appreciatively at her, and she teased him. "But you have to propose all over when you do, and I'm not sure I would say yes again." Atlas just shook his head in silent amusement as he held her tighter. When it was time for him to return, they did not cry the way they had done the previous time. They were getting used to the truth that their life together would take that trajectory. Atlas would go off for service, come back home, They would stay together, and he would go back out when the time was right. They were beginning to make peace with the truth, and Candace hugged and kissed Atlas. She promised to write him and keep him updated on everything that happened in her life, but she did not cry. Atlas was relieved to see that her eyes were dry. He had been dreading the day he would leave, because he thought that she might cry, and he definitely did not want to see her cry. So, when she did not, he raised her left hand, the one that contained the engagement ring he had bought the day after he proposed, placed a single kiss on it, and told her that he loved her. Atlas was to begin his training at the School of Infantry, and to learn to be more proficient in the field. He looked forward to it, but the training was more difficult, more demanding, and more technical than the boot camp, but he was okay with it. He was learning, he was chasing his dreams, and the woman he loved said yes when he asked her to marry him. He communicated with Candace as frequently as he could, and he talked about anything he could talk about. After 9 weeks of training, he was finally set to leave the SOI. Usually, they weren't supposed to get a leave, and they were ought to resume at their permanent duty station, but his batch was lucky enough to be given a 3-day liberty period to go home. Atlas flew out of the training institute as fast as he could. He went straight home to surprise Candace, who hadn't known that he would be home that day, and was sitting right in front of the TV with a pair of yellow shorts and a large black shirt. Her sister was there with her, and they were watching an old TV series when the doorbell rang. Chrissy, who was bored with the movie, jumped to go answer the door, and she was positively shocked when she saw that it was Atlas. She called out into the room to her sister, "Hey, it's Atlas!" Then she turned back to a smiling Atlas, slapped his shoulder, and said, "Congratulations, Daddy-to-be." Atlas knew that Chrissy said a lot of meaningless things, so when he turned to face Candace, he expected that she would either be shaking her head in amusement at her sister, or she would rush into his arms. But she did neither of those things. Instead, she stood there, shocked, and tried to pass signals to her sister, who answered her. Candace, I think Atlas already knows what's what." Candace had never wanted to whack her sister on her head with the shoe more than at that moment. Atlas did not waste any time. He turned to Candace. "Candace, what does she mean?" Then Chrissy grabbed her bag from the couch and said, "I think it's time for me to leave. Welcome back, Daddy-to-be," and she left. That was when Candace told Atlas that she was pregnant. She said that she had found out a week after he left, and she wanted to keep it a secret until she saw him face to face again. She mistook Atlas's silence for being mad, and she began to apologize before he scooped her up in his hands. He was beyond joyous. When he dropped her, to be sure, she asked, "So you're not mad at me?" He smiled at her. "How could I be mad at you when you have given me the best news I've gotten in a while? Would I have preferred to know before now? Sure, but I'm not mad at you, babe." "Oh, okay." The 3-day liberty period given Atlas by his superiors was too short for him, especially as he came back home to meet Candace pregnant. The next day after he returned home was her scheduled day for a checkup, and he went with her. He was there when the doctor examined her and told her that she, as well as the baby, were healthy. Atlas felt blessed. He had joined the military, succeeded in his training, and now his fiancée was pregnant. They made the best they could out of the 3 days. They talked about themselves and their future. They talked about their baby and discussed possible names. They held themselves and pampered themselves and laughed together. When the 3 days were up, this time Candace was not as liberal as the previous times when she said goodbye. It must have been the pregnancy hormones, or that 3 days were just too short for both of them to spend together. But she cried on his shoulder when she said goodbye to him, and Atlas did his best to assure her that he would be back as soon as possible. Atlas went off for some time, and Candace was by herself. She would wake up, go to work, hang out with Chrissy and Joanne, visit the doctor's office for a checkup, stay at home and watch TV or scroll through social media. When she communicated with Atlas, she told him everything, all about the baby, about herself, her work, how the hormones were messing her up, her sister, her friend, the woman who took too long to cost her items at the supermarket. Atlas could picture everything in her life because it was as though he was there. He, too, told her about himself. He said he was okay and that he was getting used to the military life. He said the only thing he would never get used to was missing her, and she was the same. Their love was stronger than ever. Even when they were miles away, they made each other laugh. They made each other feel loved, and they offered words of encouragement when the other person needed it. Then, one Sunday morning, as Candace was making a cup of smoothie for herself, she felt water slide down her legs. She looked down in shock. It would not take a genius to know that her water had broken and that she needed to be in the hospital immediately. Her doctor had told her that her expected date was a week from that day. So she was shocked when she felt her legs wet. Even if she wanted to, she did not have the time to blame the doctor because she frantically reached for her phone and called her sister's line. It did not ring. When she tried again, it went to voicemail. She groaned out in frustration. Where was Chrissy when she needed her? After the third trial, she called Joanne, who answered on the first ring. She told her that her water had just burst and that she needed to go to the hospital. Joanne lived 20 minutes from Candace, so when she reached her house and went on in to get her, Candace was already groaning in pain from the contractions. She gritted her teeth to quell the pain as Joanne lifted her from the couch and took her down to the car. Candace was a relatively small woman, but Joanne was the correct definition of small, as in she was so tiny she had probably stopped growing at age 15, so when she put her small arms around Candace's frames, the bigger woman wished that her sister had answered the phone. At 5'9", Chrissy was bigger than both of them, and with her energy, she could have easily hauled Candace in her arms and led her out of the house. Not the way Joanne was painfully letting her take one step after the other to come down from the stairs and toward her silver-colored car. When they reached the hospital and got in, they were immediately led to the delivery room. By that time, her contractions were no longer minutes apart, and they hurt like hell. She constantly gritted her teeth to keep her from screaming, as she tightly squeezed Joanne's hand in a way that she was sure would leave the poor girl sore. The doctor and the midwives were patient with her when she burst out crying in the delivery room. They pushed back her hair and asked her to take short deep breaths to calm herself down. When she was calm, they asked her to push again. One nurse stood by her side, and she squeezed the nurse's hand as she pushed with all of her strength that she could muster. In a few minutes, the sound of a crying baby could be heard in the delivery room, and the nurse next to her face smiled as she told her congratulations. Through teary eyes, Candace smiled back at her. When the midwife had cleaned up the baby, they brought her to Candace and dropped her in her arms. Candace was shaky as she held the baby. The girl looked so small and pink and so frail. Candace admired her as she lay divinely in her arms. She was amazed that such a beautiful creature could come out of her. The nurse took the baby away from her to the neonatal intensive care unit, and she fell asleep. When she woke up, there were about 3 different voices in her room, and when she opened her eyes, the first person she saw was Atlas, who was standing next to Chrissy. Chrissy was talking about how her girlfriend wanted them to move in together, but even a blind person could see that Atlas did not give a rat's ass about what she was talking about. Her eyes were fixated on the sleeping figure in the room, and when she finally opened her eyes, he all but jumped to her side. "Atlas?" she asked. "Yes, baby, it's me. How are you feeling?" he asked as he held her face and peered at her. She said she felt fine, and Atlas hugged her as softly as he could. When she noticed that he was in his Marine uniform, she asked him, "When did you come here?" He said that Chrissy had called him as soon as Joanne called her, and he came as soon as he could. They were both happy as they held themselves. A day later, they were able to leave the hospital with their baby. Atlas did not have much time to spend away from his base, so in a few days, after several kisses on Candace's and Emily's, their daughter's forehead, Atlas went on his way. Chrissy temporarily moved into Candace's place so that she could help her take care of Emily, and talk to her about her new girlfriend and the problems they had in their relationship. Candace and Chrissy had their bonding time with Emily, and Atlas reached out whenever he could. When he was able to come home, he came back and spent as much time as he could with them. It was always a struggle for him to go back whenever it was time for him to leave. He grew fond of his daughter and played with her all the time. They also spent time together as a family, watched cartoons, and cuddled in front of the TV. Atlas spent 4 years in the force before he was assigned a float deployment. He was excited as well as nervous to go to the deployment. He had heard that life in the sea could be tiring and could stretch on for a long time, so he was nervous to leave his family behind. Emily had just turned 2, and their family was happier than ever. He liked to stay with her in her room and have tea parties with her. When Candace woke up hungry in the middle of the night, he liked to make her food. He enjoyed the tap-tap sound from Candace's phone when she typed quickly. Yes, he had been off to the base a lot of time, but he also got time to go home. Now that he would be going off to sea, he was nervous. But as much as he was nervous, he was also excited. He was excited to experience the sea life. And when it was time for him to leave, he packed his stuff and Candace packed care packages for him. Emily hugged him goodbye and he squeezed her small frame in his large one. As she had been the other time, she adjusted his shirt, brushed her hand through his hair, and kissed him goodbye. She was so sure that she would get to see him in a short while. After all, every other time that he had been off, he came back as soon as he could. Every other time he had gone off, he came back around the time that he said he would, and she was sure that he would come back in no time. If only she knew. Life at sea was all Atlas expected it to be and more. Other people were deployed there as well, so the space was limited, and he had to continuously arrange his few stuff in his little space. The ship, like every other ship, could get dark sometimes, and being stuck on the ship was not entirely desirable. So sometimes when he was able to, Atlas went onto the deck to receive sunshine and fresh air and look at the water body. He liked to watch the water from the deck, and that was where he met Cedric. Cedric was a bulky man who liked to talk about what he would love to do anytime they were offered a liberty period off on the sea. Cedric, unlike lots of others of his colleagues on board, was friendly. He too liked to receive the sun. He said his therapist had advised him to. Said that his therapist told him that life on the ship could be depressing, and that hanging out in the gym and on the deck could be nice. Little by little, Atlas and Cedric became buddies, and shared trail mix and stories. Cedric said he had come from Nashville, and they opted for the military when stuff became hard for his family, and he had no other choice. He said that if things were better for his family, he was not sure he would ever be wanted in the military, but now that he was in it, he had grown fond of it, and he could not even imagine his life if he were not in the U.S. Marine. What Atlas hated the most about the ship deployment was the food. It was simply not appetizing, and a lot of the time he supplemented it with snacks that Candace had packed for him. Speaking of Candace, he missed her every single day. He missed his family as he lived and breathed. Whenever he could, he communicated with them, and he was happy whenever he got to hear Emily's cute voice over the phone. Atlas was assigned to sea for 6 months, and Candace had been counting the days until when he would be back to them. She was elated as days, weeks, and months went by. She knew that after the deployment, he could spend a long time at home with them, and she could not wait. It was as though he had been away from them for an eternity. When she communicated with him, he sounded impatient for the day he could go home as well, so it was a shock for her when on the 3rd day of the 5th month, she tried to reach him, but she was unable. She shrugged it off as military procedures and waited for him to call her. She waited for 2 days before she tried again. She was still unable to reach him. She got scared. She remained in constant communication with him all the while that he was away, and even when he did not respond to her immediately, it took him just a few hours before he reached back out to her. So, why was it taking him days to reach her now? She checked online and saw that the military had a few rules about communication. Sometimes the military personnel were unable to communicate with the outside world because their service provider was cut off, and only military-based communications were allowed. Maybe that's what happened to Atlas. Even when she tried to think about stuff in that positive way, she was still scared. If the communications had been cut off and the only military-based contacts were allowed, then there was surely something wrong in the sea deployment, right? She gave it a whole day before she tried again. She was still unable to reach him. She was yet to tell anyone because she did not know what to tell or how even to tell any of them. She knew that talking to anyone about it would make it all the more real that she had been unable to contact Atlas for some time, and she did not want it to be real. She wanted to hear Atlas's tired voice drawl over the phone as he informed her of the day's activities and how they drained him. She wanted to hear him complain about the food or tell her how much Cedric liked to talk. She wanted to hear him describe how the water looked when the sun shone down graciously at it. She wanted to hear his voice as he told her that he loved her, and obviously so did Emily, because barely a week since she last heard from Atlas, Emily began to ask her about Daddy. Whenever the girl asked her, she would steal her attention with any of 1,000 things that little girls liked, and it worked for some time, until it stopped. Candace continued to hold on to the rope that Atlas would reach out to her, and when he did not until the 6th month was over, she knew that she had to contact the base. They did not have any direct information about his whereabouts for her. All they said was that he was on a classified mission, and she would see him whenever he came back. She said okay, and that she only wanted to speak to him and know how he was faring. The lady who had spoken to her told her that Atlas was faring well, and that he would be back as soon as he could. Then she hung up on her. Candace was at a loss of what to do. How could she know that Atlas was okay if she was not able to speak to him? What would she tell Emily? And the worst of all was that they did not give her a specific timeline on the day that Atlas would be back. Did they not know that he had family members? She understood that they were in the military and they had their hands on a lot of things, but did that cancel out her own emotions? She felt like crying when she dropped the phone, but she did not, because Emily was just in the other room, and she did not want her daughter to walk in with her tears on her face. The girl was already on her neck about speaking to her dad. Walking into the room to see her crying definitely would make things more confusing for her. Candace knew that the only thing she could do was just to take care of herself and her daughter, and wait, just like the woman told her to. She just wished she could have at least talked to Atlas before he was sent away on the classified mission. Unpredictability was frustrating. If she had known when she would see Atlas, it would have been way easier for her. The other times that she had been away, she took them better because at least she knew she would be able to see him again. This time, she just had to hang on to the word of the strange woman who spoke to her over the phone. How could she just believe what she was told by the woman? Why didn't they let Atlas see his family before he went on the mission? A race of thoughts plagued her head every day, and she tried to remain positive that wherever Atlas was, he was faring well. She told Emily that her dad had gone on a journey for a long time, and he could not use the phones where he went. The girl asked when her father would be back, and the woman said that she was not sure yet, but she knew that the man loved his daughter, and he would come back home as soon as he could. Giving an answer to Emily got the girl off her back for some time, even though she still asked sometime about her dad when she could and when he would be back. In no time, it was already a year since she last spoke to Atlas. She never believed that the radio silence period would stretch on for that long. She did not know what to do, so she reached out to the base again. This time, an impatient man answered her and told her the same thing the other woman had told her, but only in a hostile way. Days and months went by, little by little. She began to cope better without him. It's not like she was doing better without him. No, she just had begun to cope better. She no longer cried when she thought of him. She had hoped that he would come back to her, and in one piece. She wondered if he missed them the way they missed him. When Emily played with her dolls, sometimes she would push them around for a while, then she would walk to Candace and ask her about Dad. Candace missed Atlas, but when Emily came to her and asked in her little voice about her dad, she felt like letting out a strangled cry. She would then force a smile and tell the girl that her father would be back soon, even though she did not know when Atlas would come back to them. She did the best she could to try to make Emily not feel the void her father's absence had left in their home, but it was hard to fill a void when it was embedded deeply in your heart. Some days when she sat in the living room and she heard a knock at the door, she would rush to open it with hopes that it would be Atlas. Every time she ran to the door to be met with either Joanne, Chrissy, or a delivery man, her hopes deflated. Her sister, as well as her friend, noticed everything. They knew how affected she was by the whole thing, and they did their best to bring temporary relief to her. She welcomed them and appreciated all the nights they offered to stay over at hers. She appreciated all their efforts to play dress-up with Emily, and she was grateful when Joanne went with her to baking classes. But all she really wanted was Atlas. She wanted him as she lived and breathed, and it was not long before the signs began to take a physical toll on her. Then her sister urged her to try to move on from Atlas. Chrissy did not like it when she saw her sister so sad. Even tales about all her girlfriends could not uplift Candace's spirit, so she told her what she thought was reasonable. It was almost 2 years since she had last heard from Atlas. He might have died off. It was possible that the military themselves did not know about his whereabouts and could not let her know that. It was possible that he had eloped with the woman he had fallen in love with. It was possible that she would never see him again, and holding on to the thin line of hope as she waited for him to come back was affecting her in lots of ways. She constantly had to lie to her daughter about her father's whereabouts. She had to pretend like all was okay, and she was beginning to look troubled. Chrissy asked her to consider the possibility of the negative, deal with it, and move on. But at this point, the pain and frustration had blinded Candace, so when Chrissy told her that, she viewed her as an enemy and came down on her with all the anger that was stored in her. Chrissy backed off and let Candace handle her situation the way she thought was right. It still pained her that her sister was stuck in that situation, but she knew that if she pushed her opinion, it would drive more pain into her sister's heart, and maybe even push them apart. So she did not, and Candace continued to hold out faith that Atlas would come back home in one piece when the mission was done. And in the end, her positivity paid off. One Sunday evening, she sat on their patio with Emily as she braided the girl's hair. Suddenly, Emily began to jump up and down in her chair as she yelled and pointed out into the driveway. "Mom, look, there's Daddy." Candace looked out in the direction her daughter had pointed, and sure enough, there was Atlas. He was moving towards them with so much speed, and they ran out to meet him, and all three of them met in a tight hug. They silently hugged for probably 5 minutes before they pulled apart to look at themselves. His hands held Candace's face as she sniffed in the happy and relieved tears that threatened to fall out. Emily was secured somewhere around his waist, and he kissed her all around her face. She laughed in his arms, and it was the sweetest sound he had heard in years. His hands continued to rub on Candace's now wet cheeks as he said, "I have missed you so much." She could not even say anything. Nothing she could say would capture the myriad of emotions that swarmed through her at the moment. So she just buried her head back into his chest and sobbed. He held her tightly and placed a single kiss by the side of her head before he whispered, "I love you," to her. She raised her eyes to face him. He looked scruffy. His beard was a bit all over the place, and his eyes were tired. His entire frame looked tired and looked like he needed a bath and 2 days' worth of sleep. She put her hand on his jaw and said, "I missed you so much. We both did." He nodded softly at her and said, "I know. I missed you both so much too." She blinked her eyes to hold the stubborn tears back as she asked him, "Why couldn't we reach you?" "Our ship was attacked, and from there we got dispatched on a classified run. I hated that. I could not reach you every day." She nodded in agreement. She knew the feeling as well. Atlas smiled at her. "Can we go in now? I will tell you about it later." She nodded at him and she led the way back to the house with Atlas and Emily behind her. When she heard an excited scream, she turned to see that Atlas had lifted Emily from his waist to his shoulder. For the first time in a long time, a sincere smile made its way to Candace's face. She really hoped it would remain there for a long time.